Before there were walls, there was wind. And before names hardened into nations, there was the steppe, endless, indifferent, alive. It is not a place that welcomes the casual traveler. The Eurasian steppe, stretching like a breath held too long between frozen Siberia and the heat-scored deserts of Persia, does not announce itself with towering mountains or fertile valleys. It is a land of absence and horizon, a theater of silence. Grass whispers in one direction for hours, then bends the other with the shift of a single invisible current. Here, the sky is not above you. It is you. You wear it on your shoulders. You feel it pressing against your skin like ancestral memory. And from this land, this shifting canvas of wind and sky, came a people not formed by permanence, but by motion. They lived with the dust, not despite it. They read the world in hoofbeats, not in books. Their homes moved with the seasons, their gods rode with the clouds, and their laws were whispered into campfires and sung across generations. These were the nomads, and their memory, if we dare call it that, is not written in stone, but in blood, smoke, and thunder. To understand the Mongol Empire, to truly feel its shape, we must begin not with a name, but with a landscape. Civilization often teaches us that culture builds upward, that greatness comes from brick, marble, bureaucracy. But out here, on this unforgiving sea of grass, culture is horizontal, kinetic, elemental. The horse is not a tool. It is a companion, an altar, a weapon, and a womb. By age 4, a Mongol child could ride. By 8, they could hunt. And by 12, they had seen death on the horizon and known it might arrive without warning or mercy. This was not cruelty. It was continuity. Life and death rode together. To live on the steppe was to be in constant negotiation with survival. To ride was to exist, and to exist was to prepare, not for comfort, but for collapse. There is a strange clarity that emerges in such places. When shelter is cloth and time is measured in migrations, what matters becomes sharper. The tribe is sacred not because of blood, but because of necessity. Kinship is forged through ordeal, not merely inheritance. And when the world offers you no walls, you become the storm instead. Civilized chroniclers, years later, would call the Mongols barbarians, a word with teeth and poison. But the term betrays more about the fear of the observer than the truth of the observed. To those in cities walled against the wild, the rider without tether seemed like chaos made flesh. They did not understand the ritual beneath the raids, the profound logic within the so-called savagery. For the steppe did not breed nihilism. It bred balance, between scarcity and abundance, fury and patience, death and resurrection. Among the Mongols, history was not a scroll. It was a drumbeat. It passed through breath, through fire, through song. A grandfather's tale told under stars might contain more strategic wisdom than a shelf of imperial doctrine. And when that tale spoke of wolves, of totems and omens, it was not metaphor. It was memory, the kind buried not in ink, but in marrow. The steppe breathes. It breathes through its riders, through its storms, through the silence left in its wake. And in that breath is a question: what is civilization, if it cannot ride? We begin this story not at the height of conquest, but in the womb of wind. Not in cities, but in the silence between them. For it is here that myth is born, not from power, but from hunger. Not from peace, but from pursuit. And when the time came, it would be these windswept people, these children of dust and hoof and open sky, who would remind the world that empires can fall not from within, but from the edge. The world believed it was fixed. The steppe knew otherwise. But memory alone does not explain what happened next, because the steppe did not just raise survivors. It raised visionaries. Not in the sculpted sense of saints or scholars, but in the raw, mythic sense of those who see beyond what is and hear what the wind has not yet spoken aloud. Among the Mongols, prophecy was not confined to oracles or books. It rode in dreams. It arrived in lightning over the grasslands. It clung to the mane of a stallion no man could tame. The people of the steppe did not view time as a straight path. It curled, spiraled, circled like flocks in flight, returning to test the same soul in different lives. It's why ancestry mattered, not just as lineage, but as vibration, a resonance between the living and the dead. They believed their blood carried echoes, and those echoes, under the right sky, with the right hunger, could ignite destiny. Destiny for them was not inherited. It was seized. And when we ask how such a scattered people, warriors without castles, states without cities, storytellers without scripture, could rise to burn across continents like wildfire, we forget that every empire begins as a story told with absolute conviction. And in the steppe, where written words could blow away, conviction had to live in the body. It had to ride. The horse, then, was more than freedom. It was memory with muscle. It remembered the terrain when maps lied. It outran death when cities faltered. It stitched together the far corners of the earth not with ink, but with hoofbeat and breath. The Mongol did not conquer by standing. He conquered by moving faster than fear, but speed is only the surface. Beneath it lies something stranger, older, the belief that motion is order. While sedentary civilizations built upward toward permanence, the nomad moved outward, spiraling, encircling, enveloping, like wind shaping dunes, like rivers carving stone. What seemed like chaos to the settled was, to the rider, harmony and flux. And so, when the world gazed toward the steppe, it saw an emptiness. But from the steppe, the Mongols looked outward, and saw an illusion, cities fattened with their own sense of permanence, rulers tangled in ritual, armies bred for spectacle more than speed. They saw the pulse beneath the stone, and they knew where to strike. Because from their first breath, the nomads knew that nothing lasts, that the only permanence is movement. That no border, no wall, no emperor's decree can halt the march of dust across a plain or fire across a field. In this landscape, brutal, boundless, brutally honest, the myth of unchangeable worlds dissolved like mist, and somewhere out there, in the echo of hooves, in the hunger of sky, a storm began to gather. Not just of war, but of reckoning. The world was still asleep, but the steppe was already breathing. Civilization likes to believe in its own reflection. It frames itself in marble, buries its age beneath cathedrals and columns, and measures time in dynasties and monuments. To the settled world, the city is sacred, a monument to order, a promise of permanence. Behind its walls, grain is stored, laws are written, gods are worshipped in stone. But to the nomad, civilization has always looked like a mirage, beautiful from a distance, shimmering with promise, but dissolving into dust the moment it is touched. Out on the steppe, life is carved by wind, not by chisel. It shifts. It forgets. And yet, it endures. The people who lived there, for millennia, were labeled by outsiders as uncivilized, rootless, savage. But that word, uncivilized, says less about the nomad and more about the fear of the man in the tower, who watches the horizon and knows, deep in his bones, that the world can be stolen in a single generation by someone who does not worship bricks. Because the horse does not recognize borders, it cannot be taxed or confined to a grid. And neither could the people who lived in symbiosis with it. The Mongols were not the first nomads to threaten the sedentary world, but they were the first to unmake its shape entirely. And to understand why, we must first understand a deeper truth, that nomadism is not the absence of structure. It is structure of a different rhythm, one not built for display but for survival. Where the city builds walls, the nomad builds memory. Where the empire defines laws, the tribe defines bonds. Where civilization sees the past as linear, a progress from darkness into light, the steppe sees it as cyclical, ever returning, like seasons, like migrations, like vengeance. This is why the city fears the rider, not because he is different, but because he reveals that its towers are not eternal. They are temporary pauses in the wind. From China to Persia to Europe, the Mongol wave rolled in not just as a military force, but as a philosophical undoing. They did not just destroy cities. They revealed how fragile the idea of the city really was. And this revelation, more than the death toll, more than the burning libraries and toppled thrones, is what made the world shudder. Imagine a merchant in Samarkand, watching smoke rise from the east. He does not know that the Mongols are coming. He only knows that the horizon has changed, that something silent is moving. And when it arrives, it is not the roar of battle that unsettles him. It is the silence that precedes it, the precise discipline, the absence of chaos where he expected madness. The efficiency of destruction, yes, but also, beneath it, a kind of moral logic that does not ask permission. The city had imagined itself the center of the world, but now the world was moving, and the center had become irrelevant. Because the steppe is not defined by what it builds. It is defined by what it survives. Famine, fire, betrayal, collapse. All of these are old acquaintances to the nomad. Where the empire panics at disruption, the nomad adapts, reinvents, moves on. In this way, the Mongols were not opposed to civilization. They simply did not believe it was sacred. They carried no illusions of permanence. And that made them powerful. Genghis Khan would later codify laws, establish trade routes, unite languages. He would bring order. But his foundation was built on something deeper than politics. It was built on a truth older than any empire, that control does not come from walls. It comes from movement, from knowing the terrain better than your enemies know themselves, from riding not just faster, but with conviction, a clarity that terrifies those who hide behind stone. This is the paradox. Those labeled barbarian by history are often those who see most clearly how civilizations lie to themselves. The Mongols rode into empires not with contempt, but with purpose. They did not seek to erase the world, only to reorder it. And in doing so, they exposed the illusion that the world had ever been ordered to begin with. In their wake, they left a scar not just across land, but across the myth of permanence. Because when the horse rides, the map must bend. When the tribe moves, the throne must tremble. And when the wind speaks, it does not speak the language of kings. Even today, we measure greatness in the weight of permanence. Skyscrapers, libraries, cathedrals. We assume that what lasts must be what matters. But what if permanence is not proof of strength, but of fear? What if the most enduring truths are those that leave no trace? On the steppe, the Mongols lived in felt tents that disappeared with the seasons. Their wealth was not held in vaults but in herds. Their knowledge was not stored in scrolls, but passed through breath, elder to child, fire to fire. They wrote little because the wind did the remembering. And when they vanished, they left behind no statues, no epic walls. Only the silence of a world that had been rearranged. And yet, look closer, and you'll find that the very foundations of the modern world still hum with their touch. The trade routes they protected, the ideas they carried between lands, the bones of empires they broke open like ancient fruit. That is the paradox: the empire that left the least behind changed the most. Consider this: in an age obsessed with lineage and bloodlines, the Mongols moved freely between cultures. They adopted weapons from the Chinese, engineers from the Persians, languages from the Uyghurs. They absorbed not to imitate, but to wield. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the sedentary empires, Mongol governance was built for adaptability. Merit, not birth, often decided power. Speed was sacred. Intelligence was prized over ceremony. They could vanish from one end of the known world and reappear at the other before the ink dried on a declaration of war. This is not to glorify, but to illuminate. What the Mongols offered was not chaos, a reminder that civilization, that prized, polished mask, is not an endpoint, but a posture. One storm can unmake it. One rider, with enough resolve, can redraw its edges. We are taught to fear the collapse of order. But for the Mongol, collapse was simply the moment before rebirth. Not an end. A chance to begin differently. In their wake, they left roads where there were none, trade where there was isolation and, yes, ashes where there had been cities. But through that destruction, new orders took root. The world they tore apart was never the same, and maybe it never deserved to be. The deeper tragedy is not in what the Mongols burned. It is in what they revealed, that much of what we call civilization is performative. That behind gilded gates and sacred texts lies a fearful obsession with stasis. But stasis is brittle. And the Mongols, riding with the wind at their backs and blood memory in their bones, shattered that illusion. Not because they hated order, but because they knew it must serve movement, not imprison it. So what do we do with this legacy? How do we tell the story of a people who conquered the known world, not in spite of their mobility, but because of it? Who uprooted kingdoms while carrying no throne of their own? Perhaps we begin by letting go of the question itself. Not how did they conquer, but why was the world so easily conquered? What illusion were we living in, that a people without palaces could ride through us like wind through dry grass? And what does that say about the palace? Empires are often born in marble halls, under banners and bells. But this one began in the dirt, in a yurt surrounded by wolves and wind. No golden cradle, no royal decree. Only a boy named TemÄ×jin, born clutching a clot of blood in his fist. A sign, they said, a warning, a prophecy. Or perhaps just a reminder that from the very start, his life would be defined by violence, by struggle, by a hunger that could never quite be fed. TemÄ×jin was not raised to rule. He was raised to survive, and barely at that. His father, yes, Jay, was a minor chieftain poisoned by enemies when TemÄ×jin was still a child, and when the boy's family turned to their own clan for protection, they were cast out, abandoned, left to starve on the frozen steppe. For a time, that's all his world was: ice, wind, and betrayal. He trapped rats, he dug roots, he watched his brothers fight over scraps. One day, he killed one. This is not the story of a golden childhood. It is the forging of iron by fire, where cities shaped rulers through education and courtly etiquette. The steppe shaped TemÄ×jin through hunger, through humiliation, through the raw necessity of making others follow or die. And in this crucible, something ancient stirred, not just ambition, but a kind of elemental will. The will to not just endure fate, but to rewrite it, bone by bone. In the mythology of the Mongols, the wolf is sacred, not for its savagery, but for its relentlessness. And TemÄ×jin's early years read like the life of a hunted animal that learned how to hunt back. He was captured, escaped, captured again. He earned allies not through birthright, but through charisma, through strategy, through the terrifying clarity of someone who had already lost everything and feared nothing. What made TemÄ×jin different was not that he sought power. Many men on the steppe did. What set him apart was his willingness to break the old codes to build something new. Clan loyalty had always been sacred, blood above all. But TemÄ×jin saw that blood had betrayed him. So he gathered warriors based not on family, but on merit. He shattered tribal hierarchies and replaced them with bonds of loyalty that ran deeper than lineage. He trusted those who had proven themselves through action, not accident of birth. In doing so, he threatened the very structure of steppe society, and he knew it. He did not care. Because from the moment he was left to die, TemÄ×jin had been building something in his mind. Something no one else could see yet. A world where loyalty trumped legacy, where discipline devoured chaos, and where the rider could become a king, not by inheritance, but by force of will. And so he rose, slowly, violently, inevitably. The men who once laughed at the orphan boy began to kneel. One by one, clans that had warred for generations were brought under his banner. Not through kindness, not through peace, but through precision. TemÄ×jin understood that fear, once weaponized properly, could be transformed into order. That terror, delivered cleanly, could establish a foundation stronger than tradition. He did not hesitate. When a clan betrayed him, he wiped it out, not with cruelty for its own sake, but as a lesson written in blood. When warriors defied his reforms, he demoted them. When friends faltered, he tested them. He was not loved in the way kings are loved. He was followed in the way that fire is followed. With awe, with dread, with the primal knowledge that nothing would be the same after it passed. And yet, there was more to him than steel. There was vision. Even before he became Genghis, TemÄ×jin began to shape the idea of empire. Not the kind built on palaces, but on movement, on discipline, on code. He created a law, the Yasa, not as a rigid document, but as a living force. A moral compass sharpened by necessity. He banned the kidnapping of women, protected emissaries, punished theft with the same force as murder. His order was not gentle, but it was just, in the brutal sense of a world where chaos had ruled for too long. What emerged was not merely a coalition of tribes. It was the skeletal framework of something far larger, an empire that had not yet named itself, but had already begun to breathe. TemÄ×jin was still young, still rising, but the wind had already shifted. The world did not yet know his name, but it would. And not in stories whispered across campfires. It would learn it in fire, in thunder, in maps redrawn, in walls cracked open like eggshells. The boy who once hunted mice in the snow would soon ride with tens of thousands at his back. And it would all begin not in a palace, but in exile. Not with a coronation, but with a wound. Because some men are born into kingdoms, and some are born to erase them. What TemÄ×jin forged in isolation, he tested in fire. But before the world would come to know him as Genghis Khan, world shaker, lawgiver, destroyer of cities, he was still the boy with no clan, still the exile tracing his way through a shattered landscape, gathering not just men but belief. Not in gods, but in something more dangerous, in the idea that everything that was, every tribe, every order, every rule, could be undone, reassembled, and made to serve something new. To those around him, he did not speak like a man reclaiming inheritance. He spoke like a storm remembering its shape, and in time the storm drew others to it, not all at once, not in triumph, but in fragments, like flint scraped against flint. A childhood friend turned rival, a blood brother turned threat. TemÄ×jin's rise was not smooth. It cracked open bones. It betrayed oaths. He understood something most men fear to admit, that loyalty is not always virtue. Sometimes it is weight, and to ascend, you must first cut the rope. In one moment, he watched allies falter when his vision grew too large. In another, he was nearly killed by those who once swore to protect him. His victories were not clean. They were bought in betrayals, sealed in the silence of men who realized too late that mercy was not part of his design. And yet there was always method, chilling, brilliant, and unrelenting. TemÄ×jin reorganized everything the steppe had once held sacred. He shattered the ancient blood, ties that had fractured the tribes for centuries. He dismembered the very notion of aristocracy, and in their place, he built a new order, the decimal system of command. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Not based on kinship, but on loyalty to him. What sounds simple now was radical then. It was not just organization, it was ideology. It meant no one could fall back on lineage, no one could wield tradition as armor. Every rider was measured by merit. Every general was once a footman. Every bond was earned anew. It was this terrifying equality, brutal, unromantic, functional, that turned men into machines of will. The old world had crowned its chosen. TemÄ×jin constructed his. But even more than his reordering of the human world, TemÄ×jin understood how to master something older, something even more primal: fear. Not the chaos of panic, but the weaponized precision of predictable punishment. When a city resisted, he destroyed it completely. When a rival betrayed him, he destroyed not just the man, but the line. But when a people submitted, he spared them, protected them, absorbed them. It was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. Fear deployed with consistency was not just deterrent, it was currency. And so, from the fractures of the steppe, a unity emerged, unlike anything before it. Not a kingdom, not yet an empire, but something with the momentum of myth and the mechanics of inevitability. A storm, yes, but now a directed one. The boy who had once starved beside his mother now commanded the loyalties of men across 1,000 miles. The ghost of abandonment had become the architect of allegiance. He had rebuilt the steppe in his own image, swift, lean, merciless, precise. But what most could not see, not then, not even now, was that TemÄ×jin was not simply building a coalition. He was unraveling the world's illusion of safety. He was reminding it that nothing built of stone was safe from something born of motion. That an empire without cities, without scrolls, without cathedrals could still carry something more potent than legacy. Momentum, and momentum, once shaped by discipline and rage, becomes prophecy. By the time his enemies learned his name, it was already too late. They were not facing a warlord. They were facing a worldview. Some storms begin in silence, not with a shout, but with a vow. Before TemÄ×jin became Genghis Khan, before cities burned in his wake and borders bled into dust, there was a moment, quiet, brutal, sacred, where power was not yet seized but promised. It did not begin with armies. It began with oaths, with blood spilled not in war, but in allegiance. In the flickering light of the steppe's dawn, two boys knelt in frozen grass and swore themselves to each other, not as brothers by birth, but as anda, blood-bound, soul-linked. A word older than politics, older than empire. The boy beside TemÄ×jin was Jamuka, and in that bond, a prophecy trembled. To be anda was not simply to share a path. It was to merge fates. What happened to one echoed through the other. It was love, in the most dangerous sense, the kind that demands loyalty past reason. And for a while, they dreamed the same dream: unity, strength, the steppe no longer fractured but whole. But the wind is rarely still for long. TemÄ×jin and Jamuka grew, and with growth came divergence. TemÄ×jin believed in merit, in reshaping the very foundations of Mongol society to reward ability over lineage. But Jamuka was a child of aristocracy. He saw tradition not as a cage, but as a crown. Where TemÄ×jin built his strength from outcasts and warriors with nothing to lose, Jamuka drew power from noble bloodlines and the old order. One looked forward. Both believed they were right. And so, the bond broke. Not with a whisper, but with steel. The clash between TemÄ×jin and Jamuka was not just a struggle between two men. It was a metaphysical rift, between old and new, between the sanctity of ancestry and the chaos of reinvention. Their armies met not just to decide territory, but to decide reality, to settle whether power must always come from the past, or whether it could be reborn, forged by will, reshaped by the fire of those denied by tradition. Jamuka won the first battle. He captured TemÄ×jin's allies. He boiled them alive, a gesture not of strategy, but of statement, that the old ways still ruled, that betrayal would be met with ritual horror. But TemÄ×jin learned. He did not retreat into vengeance. He grew sharper, quieter, more dangerous. He gathered his strength not from fear, but from vision. He understood that to break the steppe's endless cycles of war, he had to do more than win. He had to transform. Not just himself, but the very logic of loyalty. When the second war came, it ended differently. Jamuka was defeated, captured. TemÄ×jin could have done what had been done to his own. But instead, he let him go, a gesture that echoed louder than any execution. A statement that his power did not need spectacle. That he was not bound by the same rituals of violence. That he had become something else. But even mercy has a cost. The bond of anda had been broken, and something ancient had awakened in its place. The wolf totem. Among the Mongols, the wolf was not a beast to be feared. It was an ancestor. A spirit of tenacity, endurance, and precision. The wolf does not kill for pleasure. It kills for necessity. It tracks, it waits, it calculates. In the legends, the Mongol people were descended from a blue wolf and a doe. And TemÄ×jin, now hardened by betrayal, loss, and triumph, began to wear that myth not as story, but as skin. He was no longer just a man reclaiming his birthright. He was the embodiment of the wind's logic. Fluid, fierce, unbound. And like the wolf, he would no longer seek brotherhood through vows, but through action. Through discipline. Through shared hunger. The brotherhood he would build now would not be sealed in childhood pacts, but in fire forged through campaigns, oaths to law, not lineage. The age of noble blood had ended. The age of chosen blood had begun. From that fracture, a new order began to rise. One where loyalty was earned in the saddle, proven in the dust, tested in flame. And the boy who once reached for a friend's hand had now learned how to reach for the world, not with sentiment, with clarity. What TemÄ×jin learned from Brotherhood, he carried into Empire. Not the romance of it, not the illusion of unshakable bonds sealed in youth, but the truth beneath it, that loyalty must be chosen again and again, and that power built on emotion alone will fracture under fire. Brotherhood could inspire, but it could not govern. So he reimagined Brotherhood not as sentiment, but as structure. Under his rule, the oath between comrades became a tool of statecraft, formalized, sharpened, even weaponized. He took the intimacy of Anda and scaled it. From personal bond to military principle, from private vow to state ideology. Soldiers who rode together, ate together, lived together, bled together. 10 men were bound as one. If one ran in battle, all 10 died. Discipline was no longer enforced by threat. It was sustained by mutual obligation. Survival became a collective ritual. Victory, a shared inheritance. In this new order, kinship was rewritten. Your brother was not who shared your blood. It was who stood beside you when the arrows fell. And so the steppe changed. Where once it had been a land of scattered lineages and endless vendettas, it now began to pulse with a different kind of rhythm. One not dictated by ancestry, but by alignment. TemÄ×jin's men weren't simply fighting for him. They were fighting for a vision. One where chaos was bent into coherence, and where the old rules, brittle with tradition, were melted down and reforged in fire. It is easy to call this loyalty, but it was something stranger, something deeper. It was faith, not in the divine, but in function. In a system that made sense, even when it was brutal. Men joined TemÄ×jin not because he flattered them, but because he saw them, placed them, used them with frightening precision. A blacksmith became a general, a shepherd, a commander. Men who had been invisible under the old order now found themselves necessary, empowered, and dangerously loyal. TemÄ×jin didn't just build an army, he built adhesion. And at its symbolic core stood the wolf. Not merely a creature, but a totem, rising through legend into ideology. The wolf survives not through might alone, but through does not hoard. It shares the kill. It does not bark to intimidate. It waits, watches, then strikes as one. This was the model. TemÄ×jin had grown up hunted. Now he would hunt, but with the cunning of someone who still remembered the cold of starvation and the silence of betrayal. He turned the trauma of his youth into architecture. A political blueprint drawn not in ink, but in scar tissue. The wolf totem rose not because it was fierce, but because it was resilient. Its strength was not in the snarl, but in its memory. In its instinct to return, to adapt, to survive what should have killed it. And in that image, TemÄ×jin saw the future of his people, not a kingdom of walls, not a city of stone, but a living organism, disciplined, mobile, loyal, ruthless, a nation that could vanish like breath and return like thunder. The old world had bound loyalty to blood. TemÄ×jin had bound it to function. And in doing so, he had changed the laws not just of the steppe, but of empire itself. A storm once called by name changes its nature. When TemÄ×jin rose before the assembled tribes in 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, the sky did not split open, and no empire yet burned. But something irreversible happened that day, not to the land but to the world's imagination of it. He was no longer TemÄ×jin. He was Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Not of a kingdom, not of a people, but of a force. A new axis had been named, and the world would turn differently because of it. But titles are never just ceremonial. They are declarations of reality. And this one broke the old one apart. The steppe had always been tribal, a fractured ecosystem of rival clans bound together by kinship, pride, and revenge. Power shifted like the wind, held briefly, then blown apart by another claim, another feud, another oath betrayed. Even unity was temporary, a convenience before the next rupture. Genghis Khan shattered that cycle with the same ruthlessness he had applied to rivals and traditions. The Khan was no longer just the strongest man in a tribe. The Khagan was sovereign of a different order, not bound by the old customs, but authoring a new law, one based not on who you descended from, but who you obeyed. And many obeyed, not because of fear alone, though there was fear, but because, for the first time, the chaos of the steppe had been given direction. Chaos had found a spine, and that spine could ride. To unify the Mongols was to dismantle what had defined them. Genghis outlawed the kidnapping of women, a common practice between rival clans. He forbade blood feuds, absorbing justice into the state. He demanded absolute loyalty not to tribe, but to himself, not as a man, but as an embodiment of something larger, colder, and far more enduring. He created ranks across the empire where family lineage held no weight. The sons of slaves could command warriors. The sons of aristocrats could fall. What mattered now was function, what you could do, not where you came from. The tribal world, once sacred, now stood dismantled at the feet of something more efficient. But even that word, efficient, understates the terror of it, because what Genghis created was not just a military or a system of governance. It was a machine of transformation, a way to take the raw, shapeless energy of the nomadic world and distill it into momentum. A rider became a soldier, a clan became a regiment, a war band became an algorithm. This was the paradox. In order to conquer the settled empires of the world, Genghis had to first conquer his own, not with swords, but with structure. To claim the title of Khagan was to demand obedience from people who had never bowed, not to a king, not to a god, not even to fate. And yet they bowed. Because the old ways were dying, not in blood but in irrelevance. The horse, once ridden in pursuit of game and vengeance, now bore riders in uniform rows. Their bows curved with engineered precision, their missions executed like clockwork. The Mongol army was not a horde, it was a system. And the system worked because the past had been severed from the saddle. Maps would still call them tribes. But that was no longer true. They were now an empire in motion. A new reality swept across the steppe, like smoke turning into wind. Under the blue sky of the eternal heaven, the Tengri, all were now servants of a singular purpose, not born of it, but made for it. And the tribal world, fierce, fragmented, beloved, was left behind like a broken yoke, spilled to feed something larger. Genghis Khan had not merely unified the Mongols. He had disassembled them and rebuilt them as a weapon the world had never seen. The storm had found its shape. Now it would find its direction. But what happens when a people without borders becomes an empire? For the Mongols, this was not a contradiction. It was a calling. The transformation from Khan to Khagan, from tribal chief to world ruler, demanded not just a title, but a redefinition of reality. Genghis Khan's vision was not to preserve the Mongol way of life. It was to translate it into something unstoppable. A code of motion, clarity, and force, capable of swallowing the old world whole. To many outside the steppe, it seemed madness. How could a leader unify a people defined by fluidity? How could conquest come from those who left no cities, wrote no books, claimed no divine right? But that was the point. Genghis did not build his empire in spite of the steppe's instability. He built it because of it. The tribal world had taught its lessons through suffering, betrayal, starvation, cycles of vengeance so old they had lost their original names. These were not traditions, they were traps. Genghis Khan broke them, not with philosophy, but with velocity. He did not appeal to the past, he outran it. And what followed him, what clung to his stirrups and spilled from his war banners, was not just conquest, but conversion. A transformation of identity at scale. The Yasa, his evolving code of law, whispered its authority across language and bloodline. It was not sacred, but it was absolute. It dictated everything, from how officers were chosen to how livestock was shared, from espionage to etiquette. It enforced unity not through myth, but through meticulous design. And it did what no tribe had ever done before. It made the Mongols predictable to each other, and unreadable to the world beyond. This was no longer a swarm, this was choreography. And the horse, always the heart of the Mongol soul, became the circulatory system of the new empire. It was speed incarnate, but also memory. A warrior could travel 70 miles in a day, then pass his message through relays that spanned a continent. This was communication as domination, geography as a fluid concept, boundaries rewritten by hoof and wind. Civilizations had always believed in walls, in permanence, in defined territory. But the Mongols believed in something older and harder to defend against, the impermanence of power itself. That the world was not a series of kingdoms frozen in place, but a living terrain, vulnerable to movement. And now the movement had a name. To be Khagan was not to sit on a throne, it was to be the axis, the still point around which everything turned. Genghis Khan didn't replace the tribal world, he repurposed it. Its symbols became his banners. Its rivalries became his fuel. Its broken loyalties became his forge. Even his enemies, when they saw what had emerged, could not quite understand it. He was no emperor, no priest, no king in the mold of Persia or Rome. He was something else, a logic that devoured boundaries, a mirror that showed every civilization how fragile it truly was. And in his reflection, the tribal world saw itself, dismantled, rebuilt, unrecognizable. This was not an empire of monuments. This was an empire of momentum. In most empires, the horse is a tool, a creature of burden, prestige, or war. But in the Mongol world, the horse was not a tool. It was the empire, not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically, structurally, spiritually. It was the bloodstream of conquest and the architecture of survival. It carried not just warriors, but worldviews. It was not ridden, it was partnered. And together, horse and rider formed a new kind of weapon, fast, fluid, uncatchable, capable of breaking apart the slow illusions of permanence. A Mongol horse was small, stocky, almost unremarkable to outsiders. But it could survive on dry grass, run for days without faltering, and in the worst weather, find its own water beneath the snow. It did not wait for orders. It remembered paths. It responded to the flick of a thigh, the breath of a thought. A rider had 5, sometimes 7, switching them as they galloped, cycling exhaustion into energy. And this is what empires never understood. They built their defenses against men. But the Mongols were systems, rider and horse, bow and breath, speed and silence, all bound together in perfect synchrony. Their army was not a marching column. It was a tide. And the tide had no center. It came from everywhere and vanished into wind. Where Roman roads had marked imperial might, the Mongols left no roads, only the knowledge that nowhere was beyond reach. In one campaign, a Mongol unit covered 200 miles in 2 days. In another, they crossed mountain passes thought impossible. They used no maps, only memory, starlight, and instinct. To be a Mongol soldier was to ride not just through terrain, but through time itself, to arrive before expectation, before rumor, before resistance could even rise. Their enemies, cities with towers, kings with banners, prepared for siege. They expected formal warfare. But the Mongols were already behind them, inside them, gone again. Their riders moved like myths, appearing in places geography said they shouldn't be, striking with arrows that could kill before a sword was even unsheathed. The composite bow they carried, curved, laminated, deadly, was made for horseback. It could pierce armor at a distance. But it was more than a weapon. It was an extension of breath. Firing while riding at full speed required not only strength, but rhythm, balance, harmony. A dance between gravity and velocity. An art form that turned the battlefield into a stage, and death into a performance too fast to counter. And all of it, every charge, every ambush, every feint and flanking maneuver, was built on the back of the horse. Even their logistics were biological. Mongol armies carried no supply trains. Each warrior brought their own herds, drinking fermented mare's milk, bleeding their mounts in desperation. The army fed itself, moved with itself, dissolved and reformed at will. There was no front line. Every Mongol rider was the front line. The horse collapsed the space between intention and impact. It erased distance as a defense. It made the earth feel smaller, and the empires on it, more fragile. And so, civilization, which had always depended on the illusion of time, was now denied it. The Mongols did not give you time to prepare, to pray, to parley. They arrived before your ambassadors could leave. Their hooves rewrote the calendar. What happens when the fixed world is outpaced by the moving one? What happens when conquest is not just overwhelming, but omnipresent? The horse was more than mobility. It was philosophy. The Mongols did not conquer by building around what already existed. They moved through it, bent it, remade it in motion. It wasn't about territory. It was about access, velocity, containment, disruption. To understand the Mongol Empire, you must understand this: they did not occupy the world. They rode through it. And the sound of hooves across open earth became the new heartbeat of history. Civilizations build walls to keep the world out. The horse made sure they didn't matter. The Mongol rider could be anywhere, and worse, everywhere. In winter, when rivers froze, he crossed them. In deserts where armies died of thirst, his herd sustained him. In forests where footmen stumbled, he threaded the trees like a shadow with breath. His presence was not a line on a map, but a whisper behind your shoulder. A question: are they already here? And that question was power. Because the horse didn't just move bodies. It moved psychology. It turned distance into illusion. It replaced security with doubt. No empire, not Song China, not Khwarazm, not the cities of Rus, would ever again trust the silence between horizon and gate. That silence had changed. It had acquired teeth. The terror wasn't only in what the Mongols did. It was in how quickly they could do it, and how cleanly they vanished. You could be conquered without ever seeing them. A village could surrender at the sight of dust on the skyline. A city could fall because another, 200 miles away, had simply tried to resist. That's the paradox. Speed creates control. Not by overwhelming force, but by overwhelming decision-making. By denying the enemy the luxury of time. And in that stolen time, maps became irrelevant. Fortresses became obsolete. Even the act of resistance, normally a source of pride, became suicidal. In 1220, the city of Bukhara opened its gates, not out of cowardice, out of clarity. The Mongols arrived so quickly that defenders still stood at posts when surrender was declared. Genghis Khan entered calmly, walked to the city's great mosque, and announced to the people, "I am the punishment of God. Had you not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me." But he didn't stay. He never did. Because conquest, for the Mongols, was not about occupying. It was about rewriting. Each gallop across new territory was not just a tactical maneuver. It was a declaration this world is not as stable as you thought. Its rivers can be crossed, its mountains breached, its empires overturned, not by siege towers or navies, but by hooves, breath, and thunder. The horse became a tool of metaphysical disassembly. It didn't just carry warriors. It carried a new law of gravity, one that made everything you thought immovable suddenly light, suddenly exposed, suddenly fragile. And when we ask how the Mongols built the largest contiguous empire in history, we miss the point if we look only at weapons or numbers. The empire wasn't built on the horse. It was the horse, multiplied by tens of thousands, each with a rider who knew what it meant to trust the animal more than the map. The Mongol Empire galloped, not just across land, but across assumptions. And the sound it made was not of clanging armor or trumpet fanfare. It was the rhythm of hooves, the song of speed as sovereignty, the wind redefined as will. The Khwarazmian Empire thought itself untouchable. It had cities older than memory, markets humming with gold and silk, walls thick enough to turn back time itself. On parchment, it was powerful. In ceremony, radiant. And like so many who mistake weight for permanence, it failed to hear the sound that precedes unraveling a hoofbeat, a message, a silence. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a caravan of merchants across the vast stretches of steppe and desert to the city of Otrar. Peaceful, laden with trade goods, backed by the full weight of diplomacy. What he received in return was not tribute, it was insult. The governor, suspecting espionage, seized the caravan and executed its members. Genghis Khan replied with reason. A second delegation. It too was mutilated, their beards were burned. One was beheaded, and with that the line between worlds snapped. Khwarazm had mistaken Genghis for a distant threat, wild, chaotic, constrained by terrain. It would not make that mistake again. It would not live long enough to. What followed was not war in the traditional sense. It was a disintegration. Slow, deliberate, terrifying. The Mongols did not rush. They unfurled across the empire like a rift in the ground, splitting reality open. They came from different angles across impossible terrain, not just to conquer, but to collapse. And collapse they did. Otrar fell first, consumed by siege and betrayal. Then Bukhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, city by city, each more magnificent than the last, reduced not only in body but in spirit. For Genghis Khan was not merely destroying cities. He was dismantling an idea that stone can stand against wind. That titles mean anything to a rider who names himself. He spared when submission came swiftly, but when arrogance lingered, he made examples of it. Bukhara's mosque was turned into a stable. Samarkand's defenders were massacred after surrender. In Nishapur, after a favored son-in-law was killed, the streets ran red with deliberate retribution. And yet even this was not chaos. It was message, it was math. Terror in the Mongol system was not indulgence. It was instrument. It shaped obedience. It drew lines where none had existed before. Not borders, but psychological cartographies. Maps of what might happen to any city that hesitated too long. But the true wound Genghis left was deeper than ash. It was doubt. Because Khwarazm had believed what all great powers believe, that geography defends them, that their past ensures their future, that the sophistication of their architecture and the vastness of their armies guarantees meaning. But none of that withstood a force that measured power not in walls, but in willingness. Willingness to move faster, to punish harder, to let go of what was to control what could be. And when the Shah of Khwarazm fled, not to fight, but to vanish, his empire followed him into oblivion. No last stand, no glorious death, just a dissolving echo across ruined capitals and sacked mosques, where birds nested in domes that once held the prayers of thousands. The Mongols left behind no palaces in Khwarazm, no monuments, no flags, only the lesson: you are not safe because you are civilized. This was not savagery, it was structure, a systematic dismantling of arrogance disguised as order. Genghis Khan, through speed and fury, turned the myth of unassailability into smoke. He reduced maps into questions. And in the ashes of Khwarazm, a new understanding took root, that the line between empire and ruin is far thinner than it appears. And someone on horseback may already be galloping across it. There is a moment in every empire's story, quiet, imperceptible, when it begins to mistake stillness for strength. When the ceremonies get longer, The walls higher, the language more ornate. When maps are no longer questioned, only admired. Khwarazm was deep inside that moment when the first Mongol Hooves struck its borders like flint. It wasn't just the governors who failed to recognize the change. It was the worldview itself. A world built on inherited power, border confidence, and the mistaken belief that distance still meant protection. That the great deserts, the high passes, the bureaucratic sprawl of their dominions would act like armor. But Genghis Khan did not break rules. He broke assumptions. Khwarazm was not humbled in battle. It was overwritten. The Mongols didn't approach like rivals. They approached like physics, silent until devastating. The empire had been large, but its center did not hold. Its rulers could not respond faster than the riders who dissolved their cities. And Genghis did not simply attack infrastructure. He dismantled faith. The belief that order is inherent to civilization, the belief that cities are permanent things. Imagine a merchant watching his city fall, the skyline collapsing into fire, not in days or weeks, in hours. There's no long siege, no grand speeches, just a sequence of decisions that feel like fate arriving too fast to interrupt. You could surrender and live, or resist and cease to be. And this choice wasn't binary. It was ritual, a performance repeated across hundreds of cities. Each one thinking itself exceptional. Each one realizing too late that exceptionality did not matter. Only response time did. This was the Mongol message. Etched into the ruined civilization is not a fortress. It is a rhythm. And if that rhythm falters, the wind will enter. The death of Khwarazm was not just the fall of an empire. It was the end of a model. One where time could be controlled by structure, where prestige could shield vulnerability. That model burned. And in its ashes, a new template emerged, fluid, mobile, terrifying. Because what was truly destroyed was distance. The psychological space between center and edge, between capital and border. The Mongols erased it, and when that illusion fell, everything else followed. Even now, ruins whisper the same lesson. Domes cracked by heat. Minarets hollowed by time. Sand bearing once sacred script. The silence of Khwarazm is louder than its history. It does not beg to be remembered. It warns. Because the steppe did not send chaos. It sent order, wrapped in hooves, carried on precision, speaking a language older than empire move or fall. After the fires had cooled and the cities lay in dust, something unexpected emerged from the ash silence. Not emptiness, but design. It is easy to imagine the Mongol conquest as only destruction, a chaos unleashed on the soft flesh of settled civilization. But this would be a mistake of shallow eyes. What came next was not absence, it was order. Strange, unfamiliar, efficient, and utterly intentional. The same hands that raised cities now traced lines through them. The same minds that commanded fire now issued decrees not in anger, but in clarity. Genghis Khan did not build temples, but he built systems. And from the still smoking bones of empires he had shattered, he began to craft something audacious, law not as inheritance, but as strategy. The Yasa, his code, was never etched in marble. It was fluid, oral, and secretive by design. It moved like the empire itself, not fixed in place, but alive. To outsiders, this was unsettling, a law that could change. A structure without a scroll. But to the Mongols, this was harmony, law as discipline, not doctrine. The Yasa did not appeal to divine right or tradition. It emerged from necessity. It governed everything: military ranks, espionage, trade routes, diplomatic immunity, inheritance, even what could be eaten in times of scarcity. Mercy and mutilation lived side by side in its clauses. Obedience was demanded. But so too was merit. A shepherd could rise. A prince could fall. Justice was not blind. It was watching everything. And this law, born from a people without a script, outperformed the bureaucracies of much older empires. There were no parliaments, no philosopher kings, but messengers crossed thousands of miles without being harmed. Criminals feared reprisal even in deserts. Merchants, once wary of the wild lands between dynasties, now flowed through Mongol space like blood through a clear, unhindered artery. This was the paradox. Destruction had created reliability. Out of ruin came regulation, because the Mongols understood something the civilizations they conquered had forgotten, that power is not preserved by grandeur, but by trust and consequence. And trust, in their empire, came from fear and fairness in equal measure. You did not have to love the law. You only needed to know it would be applied. And it was. When a general disobeyed orders, he was executed, no matter his victories. When a soldier stole from a civilian, he was punished, no matter his rank. When a city surrendered, it was spared, because a promise, once given, became sacred. These were not the rules of barbarians. They were the rules of architects. And they echoed across continents, from Korea to Kiev, Baghdad to Beijing. In cities that had once mocked the idea of order, from nomads, Scribes now copied Mongol decrees. Local rulers adopted Mongol standards of measurement, taxation, and career service. Stability, once purchased through opulence, was now imposed through expectation. It was not justice as mercy. It was justice as memory. And beneath it all was the silence. Because the greatest power the Mongols wielded wasn't in what they destroyed, but in what they made people believe would happen next. In a world still trembling from conquest, law became their second horse, invisible, swift, and absolute. The steppe, once imagined as lawless, had become the most disciplined space on Earth, and its order was not fragile, it was built in dust. Civilizations often imagine that law emerges from peace, that it is the fruit of cultivation, of schools and scribes and long deliberations under marble domes. But the Mongol Empire imparted that illusion. For them, law did not arise after violence. It coexisted with it. It thrived in its shadow. Genghis Khan did not wait for stability to impose order. He manufactured order, in the middle of movement, while the earth was still trembling from siege, while embers still smoked in the ruins of former capitals. The Yasa, his evolving and partly secret legal code, was not born of tranquility. It was a code drafted on horseback, enforced in fire, and memorized in silence. It lived in the mouths of generals, not in books. It passed through memory and loyalty, not parchment or ink, and that's what made it dangerous and enduring. In the settled world, laws were brittle, bound by precedent, tangled in privilege. In the Mongol world, law was a spine. It moved with the body. It flexed. It did not break. It made no exception for nobility. It did not tolerate the indulgences of wealth or the hesitations of fear. A general could be executed for disobedience. A soldier punished for looting without permission. The Yasa was impartial in a way that frightened even those who obeyed it, because it was larger than them. It was larger even than the Khan. This was the terrifying genius of Genghis Khan's order, that even as he stood at the pinnacle of power, he was building a system that could outlast him. An invisible machine humming beneath the chaos, capable of regulating thousands of miles and dozens of languages, even as the empire grew faster than any scribe could track. And yet, no monuments announced it, no golden inscriptions, no official archives. The law lived inside the people. It was cultural before it was textual. It shaped conduct through ritual repetition, through consequence. And so, ironically, a people once seen as lawless became the steadiest source of predictability on the Silk Road. Merchants knew they could travel thousands of miles under Mongol protection without fear of robbery. Not because the world was suddenly safe, but because someone had made it costly to defy the law. Post stations were erected across continents. Distances once measured in peril were now measured in days. The Pax Mongolica wasn't peace in the modern sense. It was enforced reliability, carved not in diplomacy, but in blood-etched certainty. This was the paradox that destruction had laid the foundation for control. That the whirlwind once tamed became a mechanism. And it worked. What began as conquest now began to look like system. Traders flowed. Messages moved. Borders blurred not into anarchy, but into efficiency. The empire was not still, but it was disciplined. And beneath it all, always, was the knowledge that every piece of this machinery had been shaped in the crucible of collapse. These were laws not written by philosophers, but by those who had watched order fail, who had seen what happens when justice becomes ornamental, when rules become decorations for those with power. Genghis Khan's law was never decorative. It was directive. It pointed like an arrow. It told you where not to stand. And long after his bones were hidden from the earth, that direction remained. It wasn't written on a scroll. It was written in the way the wind moved through the ruins, steady, cold, and unyielding. To the outside world, the Mongol Empire appeared as a storm, furious, uncontainable, tearing across continents with dust and flame. But after the storm, there was stillness. Not ruin, not silence. Something else, a rare and terrible calm born not from peace, but from total control. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. But the name is misleading. It was not peace as we know it. It was not soft. It was not negotiated. It was enforced like a blade held at the throat of the world. And yet, within that pressure, something remarkable happened, the largest zone of free movement, trade, and communication the world had ever seen. Merchants who once feared 100 fiefdoms and ambushes could now ride from Venice to Beijing under one empire's shadow. A passport issued by the Khan, a paisa, inscribed with imperial authority, could turn warlords into hosts and bandits into corpses. Along these arteries of control, goods flowed like blood, silk, salt, cinnamon, ivory, manuscripts, maps, ideas. But none of it flowed freely. It flowed under supervision. This was the genius of the Mongol system. Where empires once divided the earth into hard boundaries and jealous fiefdoms, the Mongols built something more fluid. Not a wall, but a vein-work. A living network of roads and relay stations, guarded by the ever-present memory of what happened to those who defied the order. The Yam system, a vast relay of mounted couriers and supply posts, could carry messages across thousands of kilometers in mere days. Nothing like it existed in the world. It was both logistical marvel and military surveillance. A trader riding under Mongol protection did so swiftly, but not invisibly. The empire was always watching. This was not contradiction. It was design. Freedom of movement because of central control. Commerce protected by calculated violence. The shadow of the sword ensured the weight of the coin. And within this paradox, civilizations flourished. Chinese printing reached Persia. Persian medicine reached India. Astronomers, engineers, monks, and poets moved across terrain that had once been closed by tribal war or imperial suspicion. Marco Polo did not just travel through the Mongol Empire. He traveled because of it. Without the threat of Mongol enforcement, there would have been no road for him to follow. But it wasn't just things that moved. It was stories, technologies, plagues. In the same way the Mongols had erased the boundary between conquest and law, they now blurred the line between commerce and consequence. The same roads that carried silk to Europe also carried fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. The Black Death. Even disease obeyed the new physics: move faster, reach farther, affect more. The Pax Mongolica was not merely a historical pause between battles. It was the redirection of chaos into flow. A command economy at imperial scale. And all of it, the trade, the diplomacy, the surveillance, the fear, rested on the memory of what had happened to those who resisted. In this sense, the peace was not post-war. It was preemptive. A peace born of a question asked only once: do you submit? And so the steppe, once dismissed as savage, had become the nervous system of the known world. And the Khan, no longer just a conqueror, was now the unseen conductor of global rhythm. But even here, in this height of influence, a truth lingered beneath the surface. The Mongol system, built for speed and precision, had no center that could outlast its motion. It worked only as long as it moved. What happens when the horse grows still? What happens when the sword is sheathed too long? These are the questions the world would soon face. But for now, under the sky's vast hush, caravans moved. Cities whispered in dozens of tongues. And the shadow of the storm cast its longest shape, not in destruction but in order. Not all conquests end with fire. Some end with quiet agreements written beneath the weight of remembered destruction. Some are etched not in stone, but in permission, granted not because of love, but because of fear dressed as trust. This was the Pax Mongolica at its core. A global stillness held together not by shared belief, but by the knowledge of what came before it. It was a peace without celebration. A stillness without serenity. Trade boomed, cities expanded, cultures blended. And yet, above it all, like a sky that would not yield, loomed the memory of ruin. It wasn't simply that the Mongol Empire had made the world safer. It had made it narrower. Time itself felt shorter. A courier from Karakorum could reach the Black Sea in days. Merchants carried paper money that could be exchanged across thousands of miles, and engineers who once built irrigation canals in Persia were now designing siege machines in China. The steppe had become the center, not because it had cities, but because it had reach. And with that reach came surveillance. The empire did not need spies in every palace. It needed roads that made distance irrelevant. It needed checkpoints where a local official would pause and remember that somewhere, far beyond the mountains, there was a Khan whose law could arrive faster than your excuses. It was not omnipresence. It was the suggestion of omnipresence. And that was more effective. This is what made the Pax Mongolica so unlike any other imperial peace. It was not rooted in harmony. It was rooted in velocity. Even its prosperity came with tension. The boom in commerce was matched by the quiet hum of compliance. Everyone moved, but no one drifted. Merchants were free to trade, as long as they understood who protected them. Priests could preach as long as they honored the chain of deference. Scholars could share ideas across cultures, Confucianists, Persians, Arabs, Greeks, but only under the sky that bore the Mongol crest. And if that crest faded, the whole system would shudder. That was the flaw embedded in the perfection. The network was fast, but not self-sustaining. It relied on belief in the memory of power, on fear behaving like gravity, on a central authority no longer visible but still felt. And over time, that tension, between the speed of commerce and the slowness of decay, would begin to stretch. But in this moment, the machine still functioned. Its gears were oiled by tribute and maintained by memory. Its roads were arteries of ambition, pulsing with goods and gossip. Its silence was not empty. It was dense with consequence. And those who lived in its span, whether they praised it or not, understood the same truth: the world had never been this connected, and might never be again. A border is not a mountain. It is not a river. It is not even a wall. A border is a belief. A spell cast by cartographers, kings, and chroniclers to convince people that the world should stay where it is. That certain lands belong to certain names. That lines matter. But on the hooves of Mongol horses, that illusion was shattered. Maps were not fixed things in the 13th century. They bent to the wills of conquerors, scribes, and storms. And yet even within that fluidity, the world had grown arrogant in its assumptions that China would always be ruled by Chinese dynasties. That Persia belonged to Persian kings, that the borders between Christendom and Islam, Turkic lands and Slavic frontiers were somehow sacred, or at least stable. Then came the thunder of riders from nowhere. The Mongol Empire didn't just expand across maps. It redefined what maps meant, because their conquest was not linear. It was tidal, rolling in waves, receding, then crashing again, unbound by the contours that sedentary minds assumed were real. The steppe didn't care for cartography. It had no need for perpendicular lines or named provinces. Its measure was time and distance. Its logic was speed. Its compass was the sun, and in its wake, familiar worlds unraveled. When Genghis Khan's armies crossed the Gobi into Jin China, they weren't just breaking a border. They were breaking the idea that geography was destiny. When they rode west into the Islamic heartlands, they shattered a millennium of regional pride in a matter of months. The Khwarazmian Empire, which had once painted its power in merchant gold and manuscript ink, was erased not by prolonged siege, but by speed that mocked delay. How do you defend a line when your enemy appears behind it, before you even hear their hoofbeats? Even the papal courts of Europe, cocooned in their distance, began to redraw their mental worlds. Not from faith, but from fear. They sent envoys eastward not out of hope for alliance, but out of a realization that no boundary was safe. The illusion of far away had died. The maps were being rewritten by something faster than rumor and stronger than tradition, the gallop of empire. But this wasn't just physical expansion. The Mongols also dismantled the mental scaffolding upon which empires rested. They appointed Persian administrators in China, Chinese engineers in Samarkand, and Nestorian Christians as diplomats across the Muslim world. They transported not just goods, but paradigms, legal, spiritual, technological. Ideas began to move like armies, not as pilgrims, but as spoils. Where most conquerors claimed land for culture, the Mongols claimed land to dissolve the fixity of culture. And so, the world's borders blurred. Not into a utopia, but into something stranger. A web of contradictions that could only be held together by force, but also paradoxically allowed for exchange. A Persian astronomer could serve in a Chinese observatory. A Venetian merchant could find safety under the same symbol that once burned cities to cinders. The same empire that demanded total loyalty also permitted unfamiliar tolerance, as long as the loyalty came first. And yet, even this reimagined order was temporary. The moment the hooves stopped, the lines began to crawl back. City walls were rebuilt. Languages reasserted themselves. Kingdoms returned to their old illusions of permanence. But something had changed forever. Because memory, once shaken, does not return to sleep. A child born in Kiev would grow up knowing his ancestors had once feared an empire that had no borders. A monk in Tibet would still recite prayers that had been carried on the backs of Mongol riders. A scholar in Cairo would read documents signed in the name of a Khan whose ancestors had no written language. The maps had settled, but beneath them, the ground still trembled. He did not die in battle. He did not fall to a rival's blade or to some whispered curse from the walls of a burning city. Genghis Khan, scourge of the settled world, unmaker of empires, died quietly, invisibly, somewhere near the western Shia frontier, wrapped in silence by those who followed him as more than a man. A mystery was made of his passing, as if even death had to bow its head before him. Because how does one bury a storm? The chronicles disagree. Some say he fell from his horse. Others, that he was wounded in the loins by a captive princess. Some whisper he succumbed to fever, to age, to time, the one enemy no general can outmaneuver. But beneath the speculation lies the deeper truth. For the Mongols, Genghis was not a mortal sovereign. He was the axle of the world, the breath of the eternal blue sky made flesh. And when that breath ceased, something ancient and terrifying echoed through the bones of the steppe. It is a rare thing in human history, to see a single death rupture the narrative gravity of an entire world. In his lifetime, Genghis Khan had fused tribes with blood oaths and terror, bound fractured clans into the rhythm of conquest. He offered not unity, but velocity, an empire stitched not by palaces and parchment, but by the thunder of hooves and the unrelenting will of a man who had seen the abyss of betrayal as a child and sworn to master it. His laws, his war councils, his divine mandate from the sky, these were not institutions. They were extensions of his presence. And so when that presence vanished, everything wavered. The Mongols did not wail aloud. They rode in mourning silence, returning his body to the sacred earth without monument, without direction. To know his resting place was to risk defiling it. The earth itself became his tomb, the mountain his epitaph, for to name where he lay would be to admit that he was gone. But of course he was gone, and with his absence came the fracture. Not immediately. His sons and generals, men like Ku-gidi, Tolyi, Subutai, had seen the empire's skeleton drawn on sand and hardened in fire. They had learned to kill with precision and govern with cruelty tempered by necessity. They kept the storm riding, but something fundamental had shifted. The myth that had unified 1,000 rivalries had faded into memory, and in its place, only questions. Who inherits the sky? Who speaks for a god when the god has returned to dust? The Mongol system had no precedent for succession. There was no divine bloodline, no royal theology. Only charisma, consensus, and conquest. So even as the empire expanded, swallowing Kiev, Baghdad, and the Song, so too did the cracks grow beneath its hooves. Brothers eyed brothers. Regents and widows built camps within camps. The ghost of Genghis haunted every Kurultai, every council, every campaign. Because once a god has died, the world must decide was he truly divine, or did we merely believe him so? The paradox is sharp and unrelenting. Genghis had forged a realm by rejecting the structures of the civilizations he conquered. His empire was not a city of stone, but a moving storm, guided by instinct and loyalty. But storms cannot be inherited, and instinct dies with the beast. Still, his vision did not vanish. For generations, his descendants rode under the black standard. They invoked his name to justify slaughter and diplomacy alike. They called themselves his shadow, his echo, his flame. But a shadow cannot cast its own, and an echo eventually fades. And yet, even as the empire began to split into Khanates and courts, into Persian-speaking elites and Chinese bureaucracies, into rival claims and long knives, his name remained, not as memory, but as myth. A myth so vast it could hold contradiction, savage and lawgiver, destroyer and unifier, demon and dream. His legacy was not in what he built, but in what he unbuilt, the certainty that the world was as it must be. Genghis Khan shattered that certainty. He showed that civilization, no matter how ancient or sacred, could be swept aside like ash in the wind. And that fear, that awe, that fragile reverence, it outlived him. Yet perhaps the most haunting truth about Genghis Khan's death is not the void it left behind, but what rushed in to fill it. In the space once occupied by a singular will, factions emerged like fault lines beneath a once solid plain. Sons, grandsons, generals, each claimed fragments of the vision, but none could wield the whole. For Genghis had not built a throne to sit upon. He had built a momentum, and momentum once halted doesn't freeze, it fractures. The empire remained vast. On maps, its borders still held firm, stretching from Korea to the Caspian Sea. But inside, the pulse changed. Unity became negotiation. Allegiance became leverage. The whispers of ambition, once suppressed under the iron gravity of a single name, began to speak aloud. And those whispers spoke in many tongues. Dai, the chosen successor, ruled, but not with the same mythic force. He built cities, weighed silver, consulted astrologers. He organized and delegated. Yet every decision was haunted by the unspoken. What would Genghis have done? His lieutenants still conquered. Europe felt the bite of Mongol steel under Batu Khan. The Middle East trembled as Subutai moved like smoke across continents. But these were now conquests of empire, not eruption. The fire had become administration. The storm was learning to write. But something was lost in that transformation. For what had once been chaos sculpted into divine purpose now began to calcify into bureaucracy, inheritance, and doubt. The spiritual horizon of the Mongol world dimmed as it grew. The eternal blue sky had a name once, Genghis. Now it had only echoes, and beneath those echoes, the old truths returned. The steppe remembered how to divide. The great Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai, the Yuan, would soon chart their own orbits. Not rebellions, but refractions. Not collapse, but entropy. Not failure, but inevitability. Because no matter how fierce the rider, the wind always shifts. In the silence, after a god dies, the question is not whether his empire will endure. The question is whether anyone will dare remember the world before he rode. And so, in camps across the grasslands, stories were told, not just of conquest, but of destiny, of wolves in the cradle, of mountain burials and secret paths, Of Genghis Khan, who came from nowhere and reminded the world that nowhere is where gods are born, but the boy named TemÄ×jin was gone. And what remained was legend, sharpened by awe, edged with dread, carved into the very dust of history. They called it unity, once. A sky-wide empire stitched by hooves, oath, and fear. But even the strongest sinew phrase when stretched across the bones of a world. After Genghis fell silent, the empire he forged didn't crack. It echoed. That echo did not vanish. It split, refracted through bloodlines, ambitions, and the vastness of the land itself. And from that echo came 4 shadows, each bearing the shape of a Khan, but none with the fullness of the storm that birthed them. They were not rebels. They were heirs. And yet, their inheritance was a fire still smoldering, too hot to share, too sacred to surrender. To the west, the Golden Horde roamed the steppes of Russia like a wind that remembered its name. But Batu Khan's horsemen turned the rivers of Europe into borders not of ink, but of fear. In Persia, the Ilkhanate twisted itself into the ruins of conquest, seeking balance between Persian ink and Mongol blood. The Chagatai Khanate gripped the old heartlands, holding the soul of the steppe in uneasy stillness. And to the east, the most fragile illusion of them all, the Yuan dynasty rose in China, its throne draped in silk but built on the thunder of saddles. Together, they painted the illusion of unity. But beneath it, the tectonics of power trembled. For the Mongol world had no tradition of empire as the sedentary understood it. It was not built for stagnation. It was not built to last. It was built to move. And when movement slowed, identity faltered. What defined a Mongol when he ruled from a palace and no longer heard the cry of the wind across the grass? The brothers and sons of empire learned to wear crowns instead of stirrups, robes instead of armor. They ruled cities they did not build. They adopted languages they did not speak. And in doing so, they became emperors, and lost something older, something sharper. The wolf became a lion. What had once been breathless expansion became brittle inheritance. Yet, the echo of Genghis remained. Not in policy, nor in parchment, but in dread. The dread of what might return. Diplomats still bowed to the memory. Merchants still crossed the Silk Road under banners that bore his seal. From Venice to Beijing, his name was a shadow longer than any road. And in every Khanate, rulers grappled with a silent terror that the ghost of unity might awaken and devour them for their fracture. But that ghost never returned, not truly. It watched. It waited. It whispered from the steppes, from the dust of forgotten camps, from the pages of law codes, and the spines of broken rivals. And each time one Khanate struck another, not out of glory, but out of fear, that whisper deepened into irony. The empire had taught the world to fear the riders. Now the riders feared themselves. So the Khanates endured, briefly, brightly, bitterly. They traded, they warred, they governed, but they did not reunify. For the center had been not a city, not a throne, but a man. And once that man passed, the storm he summoned scattered into winds no map could hold. What remained was myth, and myth does not die. It lingers. Even in collapse, the Mongol legacy did not fall. It seeded. It haunted. It asked a question that empires still dare not answer. What if civilization is not the peak, but the pause? What if power rides, not reigns? And what if the true shape of the world was never carved by stone, but by hooves? But even splinters can shimmer with the memory of the blade. In the aftermath of Genghis Khan's death, the empire did not collapse into chaos. It calcified into brilliance, fractured, yes, but not yet broken. The 4 Khanates rose not as successors, but as reflections, mirror shards of a storm once whole. Each bore his blood. Each claimed his mandate. And each, in turn, began to redefine what it meant to rule in the name of a ghost. To the northwest, the Golden Horde galloped into Europe's shadow, bringing the sound of hooves to lands that had once mocked the steppe. Their horses drank from the Danube. Their tents were pitched beside Orthodox cathedrals. It was not civilization that contained them. It was winter, and even then, only barely. In the southeast, the Ilkhanate took root in Persia, the ancient land of empires buried beneath empires. Their Mongol steel bent toward Persian ink. Histories were rewritten in Arabic script under Mongol rule. They burned cities, yes, but also sponsored astronomers, theologians, poets. Fire gave way to paradox. Destruction laid the groundwork for flowering. The paradox of the sword, it clears a space for silence to think. The Chagatai Khanate held the spine of the old Mongol world. Central Asia, land of dust and tension. Neither fully east nor west, it was the most Mongol in custom, yet also the most cursed by division. It stood as a reminder that no land, no matter how sacred, is immune to entropy. Even the homeland becomes a stranger when brothers rule as rivals. And to the east, the Yuan, the dragon throne of China, seized and sat upon by Kublai Khan. Here, the saddle met the scholar. Silk robes draped the shoulders of a man born to the bow. The contradiction burned. Kublai sought legitimacy not through blood alone, but through the logic of bureaucracy, the choreography of court ritual. And in that search, something shifted. The wolf howled less. The paper spoke more. What emerged across these Khanates was not unity, but diffusion. Mongol essence diluted by geography, by marriage, by custom, by time. It was not betrayal. It was gravity. Even a tempest must fall eventually. What defined the Mongols was movement. And empires, by nature, are attempts to make movement sit still. Still, the shadow of Genghis did not fade. It lengthened. It became the metric by which all were measured. To rule well was to evoke him. To rule poorly was to dishonor his spirit. But no one, not even his grandsons, could match the clarity of that first scream across the world. And so the Khanates turned inward. They warred among themselves. They married into the courts of enemies once crushed. They debated theology, printed banknotes, built observatories, but all beneath a sky that no longer responded to their names. What Genghis had wielded, the mythic force of dislocation, could not be inherited. It had to be summoned, and none could summon it again. So the world spun forward. The Khanates endured, each less Mongol than the last, and yet, in the annals of empire, their ghost lingers, not as states but as questions. Questions branded in ash and hoofprint. Can order rise from chaos without betraying the chaos that birthed it? Can freedom survive its own success? What happens to a rider when the steppe turns into a palace? The answers lie buried in the dust between rivers, beneath ruined capitals, and within languages that once trembled beneath Mongol rule. The four Khanates may have ruled separately, but together, they mark the final breath of a unity that was never meant to be permanent, only to remind the world how fragile permanence really is. The wind carries memory across the steppe, not as sound, but as silence. And in that silence rode Kublai, grandson of Genghis, burdened not with conquest alone, but with inheritance, a name that shook the world, and a bloodline too vast for any one man to contain. He was born of the saddle, but his gaze fell toward palaces. Educated in the classics of China, yet descended from the wolves of the plains. Kublai lived in tension, the tension of legacy. He was both thunder's echo and the architect of its stillness. And in that paradox, he carved a new kind of empire. The Yuan dynasty was not merely an extension of the Mongol warpath. It was a pivot, a transmutation of chaos into order, of motion into mass. Where Genghis had ruled through fear and fury, Kublai sought legitimacy through the rituals of the very civilization his forebears had scorned. He donned silk robes not to abandon the steppe, but to conquer the idea of China itself. To sit on the dragon throne was not to submit, it was to consume. But the steppe does not forget, and it does not forgive. The old Mongol aristocracy whispered in unease. Their Khan now spoke Chinese. He built canals. He debated Confucian scholars. He taxed the land like an emperor, not a conqueror. They feared he had become soft, distant, civilized. And perhaps, in a way, he had. But it was not weakness. It was transformation. A storm does not roar forever. Sometimes it becomes climate. Yet the ghost of the steppe haunted Kublai. Not in dreams, but in dilemmas. How do you hold a world together when your ancestors taught you to ride it apart? How do you govern cities from a mind forged in motion? How do you write law when your legacy is fire? To answer, he turned to infrastructure, to administration, to systems. He crafted a postal network that stitched the empire like veins through a giant's body. He issued paper currency backed not by trust, but by fear. He encouraged trade, tolerance, and translation, a multilingual machine of empire running on bureaucracy and intimidation. And yet, for all his vision, something slipped. The longer he ruled, the more distant he became from the horse that once defined his people. The more he built, the more fragile the architecture became. His capital, Khanbalik, now Beijing, stood not as a monument to conquest, but as a question: could a nomadic empire survive stillness? Inside the palace walls, Kublai ruled with unrivaled grandeur. Outside, the world unraveled. Rebellion stirred. The southern Chinese resented his rule. The steppe elite grew restless. Even Marco Polo, who served him faithfully, sensed the tremor beneath the surface. The empire had grown too vast, too ornate, too settled. For the Mongols, motion was memory, and memory was sacred. But Kublai had tethered the whirlwind. He had brought the horse into the court, and in doing so, broken something primal. There is no betrayal in evolution, but there is always a cost. Kublai died not as a Khan of the steppe, but as an emperor of a dying dynasty. His heirs would be shadows fumbling through plague, revolt, and erosion. The Yuan would fall, not by sword, but by stillness, consumed by the very civilization it tried to command. And so, the ghost of the steppe drifted back into the wind. not defeated, merely forgotten, buried beneath stone cities and bureaucratic dust. But listen closely, and you can still hear hooves in the distance. Not real, not now, but waiting. For empire is not eternal, but memory rides. The echoes of conquest rarely end in thunder. Sometimes they fade into velvet, into quiet, into the weight of civilization's velvet robes. And so Kublai Khan, heir to apocalypse, builder of empires, found himself haunted not by enemies, but by inheritance. His name carried the charge of the storm, but his steps fell soft across marble floors. He did not ride to power. He ruled from stillness. Crowned not in the wilderness of the steppe, but within the orchestrated choreography of dynastic courts. He adopted the visage of a Chinese emperor, presiding over a realm not conquered by hooves, but administered by ink. Genghis had broken cities. Kublai would live within one. Yet even the walls he built betrayed him. The very palaces that proclaimed his power whispered of its fragility, for every paper edict bore the burden of contradiction, the paradox of a nomad who had caged the wind. He tried to ride two worlds, the lawless horizon of the steppe and the rigid spine of Chinese bureaucracy. In doing so, he created an empire too broad to ride and too layered to rule. There is a sorrow in transition, the sorrow of becoming what you once defied. Kublai presided over trade routes that stitched together continents, a golden thread across the fabric of Afro-Eurasia. Silk, salt, science, and scripture flowed beneath his gaze. But so too did doubt. For each year of peace, another warrior turned courtier. Another blade rusted in its sheath. Another map was drawn with borders too clean, too final, forgetting that wind has no edges. One can govern land. One cannot govern legend. And Kublai, though mighty, was not legend. He was the memory of it. His campaigns in Japan, in Southeast Asia, in the jungles of Champa, they sputtered. Not for lack of ambition, but for excess of gravity. His empire had become a great stone bell, impressive, resonant, but immobile. The swiftness of conquest had curdled into the bureaucracy of rule. And the steppe-lit watched. Beyond the court, beyond the dragons embroidered in silk, the spirit of the plains coiled in silence. The old ways, breathless, brutal, free, lived on in pockets. But for Kublai, they became myth. Stories murmured through the halls of a palace lit with foreign lamps. He grew heavy. Grief pressed down, for his wife, his son, his brothers lost to time. He ruled, yes, but he also drifted, away from the saddle, away from the fire, toward something colder, a kind of imperial entropy. And when he died, the Yuan dynasty he had built remained. But it no longer beat like a heart. It ticked slow, precise, mechanical. It would take another half-century for it to collapse, but the spirit had already departed. Kublai had won the world. But the world he ruled was no longer wild. His tomb, hidden still, rests unmarked, as if he too feared the permanence of stone. For to mark a grave is to declare something ended. But Kublai was a hinge, a man between worlds, a rider caught in the act of dismounting. The Mongol Empire had splintered, but it had also scattered seeds. And though its center no longer held, its shadow lingered, in borders redrawn, in trade routes revived, in ideas uprooted and planted anew. Civilization had been touched, not by slow growth, but by rupture, by a people who once rode with the wind and taught the world that no wall, no order, no empire was ever truly safe. Not even the one you build yourself. How the word count is already at the upper limits, 1197 1200, so only a single closing line is needed. Here it is. They came not with temples or commandments, but with hooves pounding like drums across the steppe, bearing gods cloaked in wind, and spirits whispered through the bones of wolves. In the Mongol world, faith did not descend from marble columns or echo in cathedral vaults. It moved with the herd, flickered in the flames of a campfire, and rode behind the stirrups of empire. Theirs was not a single creed carved into stone, but a swirling constellation of beliefs, celestial, fluid, and mercilessly pragmatic. To understand the Mongol Empire's treatment of religion is to confront the riddle of unity forged not by sameness, but by wild multiplicity. The Khans did not demand spiritual allegiance. They collected gods as they collected cities, not to destroy them, but to wield them. From the shaman's drumbeat to the muezzin's call, from Buddhist sutras to Christian hymns echoing in Nestorian enclaves, the empire became a great tent under which competing heavens were allowed to breathe. This was not tolerance in the modern sense. It was control as equilibrium, a calculus of spirit and power. The empire's survival depended on understanding how belief could be both blade and balm, both fracture and fusion. Genghis Khan himself kept shamans near his ear, those sky-touched men of smoke and trance who whispered the will of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Yet he also spared and patronized the scholars of Islam, the monks of Tibet, and the priests of far-reaching Christian orders. Not from compassion, but from vision. because to rule the world, one must speak in many tongues of the divine. There is a tale, perhaps apocryphal but no less true for its poetry, of a Christian monk standing beside a Muslim jurist in the court of Genghis Khan, each making the case for their god. The Khan, unmoved, simply declared all are welcome, so long as they do not disturb the order of the realm. It is a chilling and majestic view. Not a faith of salvation, but a faith as architecture, as scaffolding to support an empire swaying in the wind. Where others burned heretics, the Mongols taxed them. And still, within that pragmatic calculus lurked the shadow of annihilation. Cities that resisted were razed. Mosques and monasteries burned with the same indifference as fortresses. The great tent was open, but only to those who bowed beneath the wind. Religion did not tame the Mongol tempest. It was made to serve it. The sacred and the profane were sewn into one yurt skin, stretched tight by empire. Yet in this paradox, ruthless tolerance, devout pluralism backed by slaughter, lies something uncanny. In an age where most powers crushed what they could not convert, the Mongol vision was eerily modern in form, if not in spirit. They understood, long before borders could be drawn with ink, that minds are harder to conquer than cities, and gods more useful as allies than enemies. A Muslim scholar could travel from Baghdad to Beijing under a single banner, protected by a decree sealed with the authority of the great Khan. A Christian envoy could kneel in Karakoram and find an audience, not a sword. And everywhere the shamans' whined song persisted, invisible, primal, echoing the rhythm of the land itself. The sky remained open. In this world, faith became not a wall but a bridge, stretched taut across fracture. The empire endured, not because it believed in one truth, but because it saw in every belief the spark of mythic power. The sacred became a tool of the state, and the state became a chariot of the sacred, rolling endlessly forward, iron-bound and ghost-ridden. Civilization likes to pretend that belief is ordered, codified, categorized, constrained. But here, in the empire of hooves and dust, faith was a wild horse with many riders, and none dared to claim they held the reins. But the wind never rests, and neither does belief. What made the Mongol religious landscape so strange, so mythic, was not merely its tolerance, but its unresolved tension. Beneath the calm surface of decrees and diplomacy, something restless stirred, a question without answer, a fire without flame. What happens when gods ride together, but never kneel to one another? Even within the Khan's careful architecture of coexistence, spiritual gravity pulled in many directions. In Persia, Islam hardened its claim beneath the banners of the Ilkhanate, reshaping the memory of conquest into the language of Quran and mosque. In China, Buddhist cosmology thickened around Kublai's court, a fog of reincarnation and merit blanketing the vastness of heaven. In the Golden Horde, Orthodox bishops blessed Steppe, born princes under a cross still trembling from earlier sackings. And yet, always, the shaman waited outside the firelight, speaking only to the sky. What emerges is not a harmony, but a mirage of it, a vast and delicate balancing act in which the sacred was both weapon and wager. Religion was no longer a compass. It was a chessboard, a map of influence, loyalty, and survival. The Khans moved rooks and bishops of flesh and cloth, orchestrating alignments that held not by shared theology, but by fear, awe, and the gravity of power. In this theater of smoke and scripture, the very meaning of civilization blurred. Take the case of Rabban Bar Soma, a Christian monk of Turkic descent born near Beijing who would journey, under Mongol auspices, to the courts of Rome and Paris as a diplomat, a Nestorian envoy from the East speaking for a Khan to popes and kings. It reads like fiction. But it was not fiction. It was empire. The kind of empire that erases the familiar rules and redraws possibility with hoof and ink. It is this fluidity that defies easy narration. The Mongols, often cast as destroyers, paradoxically protected one of the most spiritually polyphonic worlds in history. They shattered the walls of cities, but in their shadow rose conversations between priests and mullahs, monks and shamans. Dialogues not of conversion, but of coexistence forged in blood and dust. They did not create religious unity. They revealed its impossibility, and then ruled the tension. Yet beneath it all, a deeper question lingers: did the empire hold these faiths together, or did the faiths, in quiet resistance, hold the empire from flying apart? The answer may be unknowable, but the image remains, of a yurt pitched in the center of the world, where no single god spoke louder than the wind, and no silence was truly empty. A campfire flickers. Around it sit men who pray in different tongues. Above them, only the sky, vast, indifferent, and eternal. They ruled the winds. But even winds falter. The Mongol Empire, so long sustained by the restless momentum of hooves and vision, began to dissolve not with a sword's clash, but with whispers. Whispers in the grain. Whispers in the lungs. Whispers in the loyalty of men who remembered Genghis's thunder and now saw only fragments, flickering like mirages on a horizon once owned. What begins the end of a myth? Is it the loss of bloodline of faith? Or is it time, that patient predator, stalking all things too large to last? In the four Khanates. Once threads in a single, woven storm, cracks had become ravines. The unity of conquest had long since surrendered to the inertia of distance, and distance is empire's slow undoing. The Ilkhanate groaned under rebellion and debt. The Golden Horde weathered power struggles that blurred brother from rival. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into shards of ambition, and the Yuan dynasty, Kublai's great gamble in China, found itself choked by rebellion and the very bureaucracy it once mastered. They had conquered the world, but could not hold it still. And then, the plague arrived not as judgment, not as curse. As consequence, the Black Death swept not just through cities, but through stories, unraveling the networks of trade, trust, and tribute that had once made the Pax Mongolica possible. Caravans stopped. Markets emptied. Faith splintered. One out of every two, sometimes more. It was not just death. It was the breakdown of memory, the collapse of confidence in the invisible contracts that held men to one another. The empire had united lands from Hungary to Korea, but now, even within the span of a single village, men feared their neighbors more than foreign swords. And what can an empire be when no one leaves home? Yet even in the face of this unmaking, the Mongol legacy did not vanish, it seeped. Into borders, into roads, into ghosts, into fear. In the Song of the Horseman, an old tale whispered among steppe riders, it is said, when the saddle is empty, the earth forgets its shape. This was the hour of forgetting, and yet not entirely, because as the Mongol Khanates shriveled, their shadows remained cast across maps, customs, and hearts. The systems they built, of census, career, codified law, did not dissolve overnight. Some calcified into the foundation stones of later dynasties. Others vanished, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later in dust, covered scrolls and bones. But most haunting of all was what could not be found. The silences. The silence where once drums had summoned tribute. The silence where once the hoofbeats told time. The silence where no one could agree on where it all began, or ended. To study the Mongol collapse is to witness not a fall, but a scattering. A migration of myth, not just people. For the Mongols left few stone monuments, no great tombs with inscriptions, no singular ruins by which we might pin them to place. Their empire was not built to endure in stone. It was built in motion. And motion, once stopped, becomes mystery. So when the riders vanished from the edges of the world, they left behind a riddle more enduring than their reign. How much of civilization is mere agreement? And how quickly does it dissolve when no one agrees to remember? The empire had been a question hurled at the world. Can chaos birth order? Can destruction become design? And in its dissolution, it asked a final, more sobering question: if you rewrite the map with hooves, what happens when the horse dies? All that remains are echoes and dust. And yet, what truly ends? In the scattered breath of plague winds and smoldering rebellions, the Mongol Empire did not collapse like a building it unspooled. It dissolved. It exhaled. A civilization on horseback had galloped across continents with terrifying clarity of purpose. And now, without warning, it seemed to vanish not in final battle, but in a slow disintegration of certainty. The edge of their empire frayed first, in steppe outposts and merchant hubs where tribute once flowed like lifeblood. As trade routes withered under the weight of pestilence and distrust, so too did the arteries of empire clog with silence. Where once silver and salt moved by decree, now bandits and suspicion filled the void. The great relay system, once a marvel of logistical genius, became a relic haunted by memory. A skeleton of the roads, traveled only by ghosts and thieves. From the east, the Red Turban Rebellion rose not just as a political movement, but as a spiritual response to famine, disease, and the perception that heaven had withdrawn its mandate. In the Yuan capital, power turned inward, then downward, until even the emperor's name rang hollow. And in the west, Timur, the self-anointed heir of Genghis's flame, would rise from the ashes, not to restore but to reimagine. A mirror of the past, cracked at the center. But to say the empire had died is to mistake form for spirit. The steppe had long known this truth: power is not a stone monument. It is not a wall. It is not a throne. Power is movement. Momentum, the pulse of possibility. And once that rhythm is lost, the body forgets how to stand. The Mongols had rewritten the world not by building towers, but by erasing assumptions. They proved that civilization could ride, not root. That laws could live in saddlebags. That empires need not speak one tongue, so long as they bowed to the sound of hooves. When they crumbled, it was not a failure of vision, but a reminder of its cost, a price always paid in entropy. And as the last Khanates dimmed, what remained was a peculiar kind of silence, not absence, but echo. It lived in the corridors of courts shaped by Mongol bureaucracy, in the merchant scripts that blended languages once foreign to each other, in the awe that still clings to the name, Genghis. Like thunder long gone, but never quite forgotten, the world they shattered, and the strange, stitched world they left behind, proved one thing above all, that even myths must reckon with mortality. For every empire is a kind of spell, a shared hallucination. But the steppe had always whispered its counterspell: nothing stays, not borders, not bloodlines, not gods. Only the wind remains, searching for new riders. They say an empire dies twice, first when its banners fall, and then when its memory fades into myth. But what of an empire that never had a center? That did not rise from stone, but from the echo of hoofbeats and the dust of dreams. What of a legacy that gallops instead of stands still? The Mongol Empire did not end with a single sword thrust or final siege. It ended like a tide receding, gradually, imperceptibly, until the world forgot where the water had once touched. Its rulers, once feared as horse-born gods, left behind no pyramids, no cathedrals, no grand capitals meant to weather centuries. What they left was breath invisible, but shaping the world long after they had vanished from it. There was no heir in the traditional sense. No final Khan to close the book, because to inherit the Mongol Empire was not to hold land, but to grasp a paradox. Its power had always been centrifugal, not central. The moment one tried to possess it, to fix it in place, it began to slip away. Kublai tried. So did his brothers, sons, and claimants. But they misunderstood the inheritance. The steppe does not reward permanence, it rewards motion, and motion by nature cannot be passed down like a crown. Instead, the empire scattered into traces, into postal systems that would inspire global logistics centuries later, into legal codes that traveled farther than their enforcers, into fractured Khanates that whispered their ancestry even as they betrayed it, and into the minds of rulers from Moscow to Delhi to Istanbul, who invoked Genghis's specter, not to preserve the past, but to summon legitimacy from its ashes. And yet, perhaps its truest legacy is not found in blood or policy, but in the deep philosophical fracture it carved through the heart of world history. Before the Mongols, many civilizations believed in walls, literal and ideological, in borders as destiny, in cities as the crown of humanity. But the horsemen of the steppe had no interest in being impressed. They had seen the horizon curve. They had known the sky without ceilings. To them, empires were not sacred, they were vulnerable. And so they tested them, and broke them, and reassembled the pieces into something new. In this way, the Mongol Empire remains an unsettling mirror. It asks not just how history is made, but who has the right to make it. It forces us to confront the illusion that complexity equals superiority, that fixed capitals are wiser than mobile camps, that peace is always born from gentleness and not from the edge of a blade. And most disturbingly, it reminds us that what we call civilization may only ever be a pause, a lull between storms. The heirs of the Mongol world are not found in dynasties, but in disruptions, in the merchants who trace silk roads newly cleared, in the travelers who expect protection across borders, in the governments who dream of unity imposed by speed, surveillance, and reach. The shadow of the steppe lingers in every system that seeks order through overwhelming momentum. In the end, the Mongol Empire may be the only empire that left no heir, because it was never meant to be possessed. It was meant to pass through, like wind, like fire, like myth. What if everything we were taught about civilization, its permanence, its superiority, its inevitability, was wrong? The Mongols rode into history not simply as conquerors, but as reminders. Reminders that what the settled call progress may in fact be paralysis, that what we name chaos might be another form of clarity. They were a people whose entire existence inverted the norms of the so-called civilized world. Where others built towers, they built trust in the horizon. Where others walled themselves in, they opened paths. And where others planted roots, the Mongols rode with the wind, not as lost wanderers, but as those who understood that to move was not to drift, but to endure. To see the empire they carved and not merely gasp at its violence, but to study the scaffolding beneath it, is to glimpse a different understanding of order. An empire not built on stone, but on rhythm, of movement, of message, of law delivered at the speed of a galloping horse. The Yam system, their sprawling relay of mounted couriers, did more than connect cities. It synchronized worlds. It proved that coordination did not require walls or even cities, only discipline, intent, and unmatched velocity. And beneath their discipline was a radical pragmatism. Religion, to the Mongols, was not a cause for war but a means of governance. Tolerance was not weakness but weaponized wisdom. Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, shaman, all were granted space beneath the tent, provided they did not fracture the whole. To rulers who built unity through sameness, this was inconceivable. To the steppe, it was intuitive. Because when you rule not from a capital, but from horseback, you must know how to listen to every language spoken around your fire. Yet perhaps the Mongols' most subversive teaching is what they did not teach. They never claimed to be the pinnacle of history. They offered no immortal ideology. They boasted no divine manifestos. And so when their empire fractured, it did not pretend to have been eternal. It had done its work and moved on, leaving behind new shapes, new possibilities, and the unsettling thought that civilization's permanence is itself a myth. The modern world inherited more from the Mongols than it dares admit: international trade routes that mirror their silk arteries, surveillance states that echo their census and code systems, mobility as power, speed as sovereignty, and yet, the nomadic logic behind these structures, the spirit that made them fluid, adaptive, dangerous, has been buried beneath concrete and bureaucracy. But the lesson remains. The lesson that civilization is not a ladder, but a wheel. And the wheel turns. It is no accident that their greatest symbol is the horse, not simply a tool of conquest, but an extension of vision, a being that lives between ground and sky, in motion, neither domesticated nor fully wild. To ride it is to defy the illusion of stasis. To follow its path is to understand the world not as a fortress to defend, but as a vast, ever-shifting plain to traverse. The Mongols did not merely challenge the great empires of their time. They humiliated them, not because they hated civilization, but because they exposed its fragility. Its walls were not proof of strength, but of fear. Its gold not proof of wealth, but of rot. Its scripts not proof of wisdom, but of detachment. And so, from the edge of the known world, the horsemen came and rewrote the map, not with ink, but with fire. Even their silence was a kind of critique. The lack of monuments, of grand palaces or holy tombs, forces us to remember them through motion, through echoes, through dust. And perhaps that is the final inversion, that those who seem to possess nothing have left us with everything to reconsider. The Mongols did not just conquer lands. They conquered the idea that there is only one way to live. They vanished like a gust across the steppe. No mausoleums, no statues, no marble-carved ideologies left to gather dust beneath the weight of time. And yet, the world still whispers their name. The Mongol Empire, at its most immense, sprawled farther than any land empire before or since. But it was never made to last in the way that marble cities and written laws presume. It was an empire carved in wind, not airless and void, but full of force, breath, movement. The kind of power that arrives without warning, reshapes what it touches, then vanishes, leaving only stirred dust and the altered memory of what came before. And in that memory, something strange lingers. For most empires, legacy is tethered to land, to borders etched in stone, to capitals burdened with architecture. But the Mongols left a different kind of inheritance. Not geography, but velocity. Not monuments, but myths. They're remembered not for where they stood, but for how they moved, and how the world, in trying to catch its breath, was never the same again. There's something spectral in the way they persist. In Persian poetry, they are horsemen of the apocalypse. In Russian legend, a shadowed force of fire and ice. In Chinese annals, civilizers and devils, both at once. And in the West, echoes still surface in the myths of Tartary, in half-remembered fears of riders descending from nowhere. The facts dissolve, the stories harden. And that too, that shape-shifting afterlife, is power. Because when a force moves faster than language can capture, it becomes legend. Genghis Khan, once TemÄ×jin, the hunted child of a discarded clan, was buried in secret, his grave trampled by hooves until no mark remained. And perhaps this was fitting. His empire, too, left no single tombstone, only trails, only transformations. Cities rose where there had been silence. Scripts were invented. Roads stretched like sinews across Asia. But over it all loomed the sense that the steppe was watching, breathing, waiting. That what had come once could come again. Even their laws, the yasa, whispered more than written, passed down like ghost, script between the ribs of campfires, untraceable and binding all the same. It wasn't permanence that made their order endure. It was ritual, repetition. The rhythms of war, of migration, of tribute and loyalty pledged beneath a sky too vast to conquer. The Mongols taught the world how to break, and how to rebuild in motion, how to extract unity from difference, how to harness terror without worshipping it, and in the end, how to vanish more completely than any civilization before them. Because disappearance was the final stroke of their genius. In the sacred silences after their flames had passed, they left other empires trembling, not because the Mongols remained, but because they might return. That was their ultimate monument, a fear lodged in memory, a wind that never quite settled. And today, we still live in that aftermath. Every time borders shift, every time trade races faster than governments, every time civilizations confront a force beyond their categories, we are haunted by the horsemen, not because they were cruel, but because they showed us how thin the veil of order truly is. What happens when empire becomes airborne? When its essence is not housed in buildings, but carried in myth, then history itself becomes vapor, and memory the new terrain of conquest. So the Mongols ride on, not in flesh but in form, in ideas and infrastructure, in awe and apprehension. They are the ghosts of acceleration, the avatars of a world perpetually in flux. And if we listen, truly listen, we might still hear hooves on the horizon, not as a threat, but as a question. What is civilization, really, and who decides when it begins or ends? The steppe remembers what cities forget. It remembers not in books or stone, but in breath and wind, in hoof-beaten silence. Where empires crumble beneath their own weight, the horse endures, eyes scanning a horizon too wide for walls, too shifting for maps. It does not mourn conquest, nor sing of nations. It recalls only movement, the rhythm of pulse and thunder beneath the open sky. And so, in the final pages of the Mongol Empire's story, if stories even end, we are left not with a flag or a boundary, but with a question that rides beside us. What did the horse remember that humans did not? Perhaps it remembered the world before borders, before cities believed themselves eternal, before law was written on parchment instead of wind, when power was not yet buried beneath ritual and bureaucracy, but was raw, elemental, a gallop, a charge, a cry that split the heavens. It remembered that fire clears ground, that empires are not inherited, they are claimed, challenged, lost, and reborn in different forms. That control is an illusion stitched together by fear and repetition. And that no matter how wide a palace spreads, it cannot outrun the storm that sees it as temporary. The horse was there when TemÄ×jin became Genghis. It was there when arrows whistled through the gardens of Persia, when banners flew over the plains of Hungary, when envoys rode from Cairo to Karakorum under skies stretched taut with tension. And it was there when the camps fell silent, not in defeat, but in transformation. Because the Mongol Empire did not vanish. It sublimated. It melted into the veins of the world it had once dismembered. It seeded systems, of relay stations, of trade, of governance, of diplomacy, that far outlived its thundering hooves. It taught empires how to breathe through fracture, how to absorb chaos, how to wield terror as a tool, not merely as a fate. It showed that the collapse of one order need not signal the end of meaning, only the shift of its axis. And still, the horse remembers. It remembers that civilization is not a line etched across the land, but a tide ever receding, ever crashing forward. That what is called barbarism by the settled is often just another language for resilience, for adaptation. That the true edge of the world is not where the maps end, but where certainty begins to crack. It remembers that even silence speaks. For long after the banners fell, and the cans turned to dust, the world they shaped whispered with the gravity of their presence. In markets and alphabets, in military manuals and legal codes, in the shadows of Western fears and Eastern reforms, the Mongols haunted the blueprint of the modern world. Not as destroyers, not as saviors. As something harder to hold, unmakers of the myth that civilization is fixed, rightful, and inevitable. And what does the horse carry now, galloping across memory's plain? It carries the echo of a question: what lies beyond our borders still? What myths ride toward us beneath tomorrow's dusk? Will we mistake them, as before, for chaos? Or will we recognize in them the pattern of change? The Mongol Empire ended not with fire, but with forgetting. And so perhaps the horse remembers for us, so that one day we might remember too. Not to glorify destruction, but to humble permanence. Not to romanticize conquest, but to see the mirage for what it is, shimmering, shifting, and always one gallop away from vanishing. And in that moment of awe, breathless, terrifying, reverent, we begin again. In the sacred silence after fire, we listen for hooves.